In this video, I'm going to try to open up some of the issues for critical discussion around Oroonoko. And there are many, and this narrative has attracted a lot of attention and criticism. Although, as I've mentioned before, for many years it was obscured. But since the 1980s, it's been pretty popular and it's been part of the curriculum. And there's been a very lively and fascinating critical discussion about what is going on in this narrative. I was about to say novel, but I don't, that's one of the controversies, is whether or not we can call it a novel. And also maybe even, can we call it the first novel? And does this teach us something about the genre of the novel? So the first issue to think about, one of the very first issues that people think about in Oroonoko, is the question of race. The word race is actually used in the novel, but it doesn't mean skin color or place of national origin. It actually refers to, Oroonoko is distressed that he will be the last of his royal race. So race is specifically based on blood, but it has to do with your elite blood or lack thereof by birth. So the word race has a different meaning, but is there a familiar concept of race in this novel? Is Oroonoko, is he is certainly described as above the other Africans. And so you could say that it divides racially, but he's an exception, and he's physically exceptional. And Mwenda is the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen, and he is the handsomest man that anyone had ever seen. And I'll just say that that's fairly typical for the romance genre, to create these extraordinary characters. But the fact that she creates extraordinary characters who are African, maybe that's significant, although there are those in romances as well. So that's already part of the genre. It's not outside of the genre. And so he is extraordinarily attractive, but he also resembles Europeans in certain respects. Like he is described as having European features. He has somewhat of a European education. He had a tutor, and he knows about the civil wars, and he knows about the lives of the Romans. So he has a kind of European education and a European appearance. On the other hand, I've always found it fascinating that he is generally European in appearance, but at the same time darker in his skin color than any of his other people from his country who the narrator has seen. So he is particularly dark, but he has European features. So there's maybe like a little tension there between how much he is like Europeans, how much he is different from Europeans. So then, if the categories of race are different, what are the parameters of human difference in Oroonoko and in the 17th century in general? So a lot of people have argued that really it was religion rather than skin color that distinguished types of people in this period. And religion doesn't really come up a lot in this novel. So I don't really know if that is really what's going on. And certainly the Africans, the society that Oroonoko came from, is not represented as primitive or barbaric. In fact, the opposite is represented as highly refined, highly sophisticated, with a evolved sense of honor that seems to be missing in the English context. However, there is clearly like very important differences in social status. The English colonists are lowly, barbaric, frightening sorts of people. There's nobody quite that disturbing on the African side. And so you could say that clearly there's a kind of equality between birth and worth in Oroonoko. On the other hand, if you go to the very top with the grandfather, who's the monarch, he's really not so great. So that's a kind of question to think about as well. So this is one of the first narratives written about slavery in the English context, and so how does it depict slavery? Is slavery accepted? Is it seen as a normal thing? Are there sort of nuances in slavery in this narrative? I've always thought that it's interesting that Afroben probably, had this experience in the early 1660s, but didn't write about it until the late 1680s. And one question might be why, and one possible answer might be that she really withheld writing about this until Charles II was dead. And Charles II was very, very active, as I've discussed before, in the Royal African Company, as was his brother James II. James II was the governor of the company. And so writing about slavery in a way that was revealing of its cruelty probably would have been dangerous as a writer until you felt that the Stuarts couldn't hurt you anymore, which is possibly what was going on. I don't know, but I wonder about that gap and about writing about it in the year that James II is actually overthrown. So, which is not to say this is an anti-slavery narrative. I mean, it is way before any kind of abolition movement, but certainly it makes slavery as an industry look pretty bad, and we've seen that in other writing by Afroben. So I think another insight that Afroben gives us about slavery is that it's not one thing, and that Oroonoko is himself a slave trader. There is slavery happening in Coromantien, but it does seem to be categorically different than the kind of slavery that is experienced in the New World context. So in the Coromantien context, Jamoan is technically his slave because he's captured in war, and that's the argument that, and actually you see that in John Locke. John Locke argues that the only time slavery is acceptable or legitimate is if you capture somebody in war and you have the option to kill them, you can allow them to live as your slave. So that's the system that's operating in the Coromantien of the first part of the novel. And so, but when you get to the second part of the novel, it's one of Oroonoko's arguments is that our enslavement is not legitimate because these lowly people have not defeated us in battle. So what you see in the second half, in the Suriname part, is something that's a purely capitalist enterprise that has no kind of grounding in some sort of honor-based idea of a contract, that it's just simply raw power that's happening there. So then monarchy is, of course, another issue that is raised in this. I've just talked about that, about how the one monarch we actually see in this novel is not really admirable, and that Ben is writing at a time when the whole institution of monarchy itself is unstable, and you have to think about, is that good or bad? I mean, one thing that you see in Suriname is that there's a kind of free-for-all because there's nobody really in charge, and because there's nobody in charge, there's a complete lack of honor and dignity and respect. And so and those things exist in Coromantien, which is presented as a much more functional and respectful culture, although that has its problems as well, because love can't flourish in the way that the hero wants it to in Coromantien, and the monarch has too much power and he's not worthy of his power. So it's complicated. Um, so so I think another thing to think about is what what are the emotional ranges of the characters in this novel, and also what sort of emotions does it convey, and does it make an emotional argument about slavery and or colonialism? If not, if it clearly doesn't make any kind of um, explicit political argument about those things, that is there some sort of, well, later in the abolitionist movement, there was much reliance on sympathy and empathy. And that comes later in the 18th century when philosophers of emotions start to emphasize sympathy. But Hobbes, of course, didn't recognize sympathy or empathy as part of his emotional scheme at all. He just has pity. And pity is kind of self-serving, because you have pity for those who you think you could end up in their situation. So what is going on when we see Oroonoko suffer? Is there are we invited to empathy? Are we invited to sympathy? Are we invited to pity? And what would be the difference? And how would we know? And what can we imagine Ben's readers experiencing about that? And what would be the politics of the difference between sympathy, empathy, and pity? It's himself, Oroonoko, has outsized heroic emotions. He has, uncompromising, very, very profound love for Imawenda, and very, and mostly he is outraged that she will, that their child will be born into slavery. And that's also a distinction between a particular kind of slavery in which it's hereditary. And that was what was evolving in the 17th century, that we call chattel slavery or plantation slavery, where the person is, not only are they enslaved for life, but all their descendants are enslaved as well, that the slavery passes from the mother to the child. So, and this is the part of the outrage that is worse than death for Oroonoko, and that's what he stakes his life and death on. And Imawenda as well embraces her own death rather than bring a child into the world who will be condemned to slavery. And it's not just being condemned to slavery, but it's being done so without any agency, without kind of losing in a fair fight, which was kind of what you see in Coromantien, of just being branded that way. And so this is one thing that I think is entangled in theories of emotion of the 17th century to think about. Also, does it matter that this is written by a woman? Does that make any difference at all? There was much discussion about that when this narrative was sort of originally rediscovered and brought to attention. Does it matter does she have a particular perspective? I mean, certainly the narrator's gender seems to be important certainly in Suriname, because she is rendered both powerful and important and helpless in different ways. Like she's both honors Oroonoko, but she's also afraid of him, and she fears the slave rebellion, which may not have to do with gender, but the narrative is not told from the point of view of somebody who is putting down the rebellion, but rather by somebody who's running away from it. And so she's kind of this, she's in between because she enjoys the company of Oroonoko, and yet she fears him as well. Finally, what is this thing? Is it a novel? Is it a romance? Is it a travel narrative? Is it a political allegory? Is it, at least one critic has argued that it's basically a message to James II to beware that the people are going to rebel against him. So there are many things, many genres into which this could fall. I think my preference is actually thinking of it as revealing the origins of the thing we've come to call the novel, which is a combination of realistic detail, the realism of the travel narrative in this case, but also the romance of the heroic narrative on the other. And so a novel that is there, I mean, there are no novels that are pure realism. And so somehow bringing together kind of things that could happen that have observable details about life in them with things like coincidences, really sort of larger than life figures, comes to really define this genre. And I feel like when we read Oroonoko, we can see the separate pieces of it, and we can see how they're going to get folded together later in the century.